Good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this Arboricultural Association webinar, live from our headquarters here in Stonehouse in the UK. My name's John Parker, and as of pretty much right now this minute, I can say I'm Chief Exec of the Arboricultural Association. Hurrah! And welcome to you all. Please use the chat to say hello. Let us know where you're watching from. Is my head looking bigger today, or am I leaning further forward? I've been moving my desk around. It's all very confusing. Let us know where you're watching from. Use all panelists and attendees to send your message. Otherwise, not everyone will be able to see where you are. Any questions through the Q&A panel, please, and clearly specify which of our speakers you're aiming your question at if it's to somebody specific. As ever, I'd like to give you a quick heads up about next week's webinar, which will be, another evening with Ted Green. Yes, that's right. It's only taken me 4 months to recover from the last one, but we've asked Ted back. What's it going to be about? Nobody knows. Are you going to learn anything? I don't know, but it'll be lots of fun, and it will be interesting and very inspiring as always. So you can register free for that one right now using the link in the chat. Also, of course, please remember that bookings are now open for the Arb Association Conference 2021 to be held in Loughborough in September. It's a face-to-face conference. Remember them? Yes, of course you do. And we can't wait to welcome you all back for a few days of trees and society, and an awful lot of catching up with friends and colleagues, as well as plenty of fun activities. It's going to be brilliant. You should sign up now and take advantage of the early bird offers. This evening, we welcome two great speakers from all the way across the water in Canada. Sophie Nitoslawski will be speaking first about smart cities, and then we'll be handing over to Angela Rout to hear about some of her work in using data to understand the relationship between people and nature in cities. We'll probably be running for about an hour, maybe a little bit more tonight. Sophie's in demand and has got to go to another webinar. So we'll go on till about 7-ish or something like that. If you've got a question for Sophie, that means get it in early. Or, as always, you can contact me directly, john@trees.org.uk. If you've got any more questions or you want to follow up or ask for presentations or whatever like that, please just email me. So let's crack on. Sophie, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for that great intro, John. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm so excited to chat about some of the awesome work that is happening way over on the other side of the pond in Canada. So my name is Sophie. Really quickly, I'm a PhD candidate in urban forestry at the University of British Columbia. And I am super interested in the intersection between tech, trees, and towns. And that is what myself and Angie will be talking about today. And before I begin, it's important. Oh, my screen just froze. Can everyone see this? Can everyone give me a quick, good? All right, everyone's fine. It's important to talk about what's happening right now in some parts of Canada. I don't know if anyone is aware, but we are dealing with an incredible heat wave in the west part of the country. It may surprise some of you to know that Canada is not comprised of only igloos and polar bears. Canada is actually going to face some of the brunt of climate change impacts. And so we're dealing with an incredible extreme heat event. This will likely not be the first, or it won't be the last. It hasn't been the first, but this is going to be happening more and more. And we know that green infrastructure and urban trees do have a part to play in low carbon and low-cost solutions in the long term. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. We're all here for a reason. Why are we here? We know that this is important, but I do want to emphasize the fact that a lot of our work, a lot of our research is grounded in the fact that urban green infrastructure, urban forests, nature-based solutions are multifaceted, and they provide a range of services, particularly in the context of climate change, climate response, and climate resilience. Meanwhile, we're increasingly recognizing this. COVID has, of course, brought forward this importance of parks and green spaces in a time of pandemic, and now we're dealing with the impacts of climate change. What we're also seeing is that cities are increasingly interested in the integration of digital technologies into the fabric of kind of urban landscapes. And so depending on where you are in different parts of the world, there are some cities that have already started developing policies around smart cities, digital cities, intelligent cities. What does it mean to start using data and connected technology to enhance the delivery of municipal services? So we live in a time of extreme connectivity. This is, happening pretty much ubiquitously. But of course, I'll talk about potentially some issues around that in a little bit. And there are questions around what this means for the management of urban trees and urban green infrastructure. So before I really delve into the meat and potatoes of this, I think it's important to take a little bit of a step back and ask ourselves, what is the smart city? And I should mention that, I'm speaking very much from the Canadian context. Angie and I are working together at the University of British Columbia. And so some of this work is definitely grounded in Canada. There are lots of different definitions that are kind of going around. We can go back to the 80s and 90s where we started talking about intelligent cities, wired cities. This is a definition that a nonprofit organization up here called Open North in Canada has developed. So it's a place where residents, different members of civil society collaborate to mobilize data and technologies when warranted in an ethical, accountable, and transparent way to govern the city. This is a fairly long definition. I tend to just go with something a little bit simpler, which is essentially just the idea of using data and connected technology to improve quality of life in cities. So it's quite broad, but it helps ground us in terms of really what we're dealing with when we talk about a smart city. And to get a little bit further into that, what I like to think about is two kind of main technologies that reflect some of the processes that take place in a smart city. So we've all heard of the cloud. So I think about the cloud, it's kind of like a centralized repository where you throw a lot of data up there and a lot of data kind of comes shooting out. But the idea here is that the cloud can be used as a bit of a metaphor for the idea that data and information technologies can be harnessed to more efficiently provide services to citizens. So really simply, the idea that cities, municipalities, and governments can use data to enhance the delivery of services to citizens. Now, on the other side of the coin, I also like to think about the smartphone as a metaphor for the more kind of grassroots or ground up smart city concepts or initiatives that can take place. When we think about the smartphone, I mean, it has been instrumental in some grassroots initiatives and organizations. And there's something to be said for investments in social capital and participatory governance schemes that can also result in a higher quality of life. And so when I talk about smart cities, I often like to bring up this idea of like the cloud, but also the smartphone to highlight that there's like a broad spectrum of technologies and concepts that we might be dealing with in a smart city. One of which, or a few of which, might be maybe a little bit more top down, but many of which are also very much bottom up. And it's a question of figuring out exactly which are perhaps best for the problems and the issues and the challenges that we face in cities. And so, given all this, though, what does this mean for urban forestry? And there's a dearth of research and of kind of practical implications for smart cities in the context of urban forest management. And what's really exciting is that we've really entered a phase or kind of, a moment in the world right now where there is a fair amount of ubiquity in terms of digital integration into the urban landscape. And so there are real possibilities here for using digital and smart tech for managing urban trees. And so what I'm going to be talking about this presentation is just kind of high level concepts around smart cities and urban forest management, but also grounding it in some of the work that we're doing at UBC. And one of these projects is a horizon scanning project. So the idea is to really figure out in the landscape what is going on at the intersection of digital and smart technologies and forest ecosystem management. And so what we did is we did this huge, what we call a scoping review, huge literature review across different databases to figure out exactly what's going on in the world. And what we found, here are the kind of top 6 countries in terms of research output. This is purely research, not necessarily policy or white paper oriented, that look at this intersection between digital technologies and forest ecosystem management. And this is not necessarily just urban areas. This is kind of broadly forest ecosystems. What are we dealing with? And as you can see, which is perhaps not entirely surprising, the United States kind of leads the pack. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I'm sure you can notice from this image that there is clearly a divide happening here. There is clearly a lot of research that is coming out of certain countries for a variety of reasons, and it's important to keep that in mind because, divisions and inequities, especially in the context of green infrastructure and forest ecosystems, are paramount to address in terms of sustainability. And so I'll talk about the digital divide in a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight, broadly, from a geography perspective, this is what we're dealing with in terms of this intersection. And what we also did was we started looking at why are technologies being used in forest ecosystem management? And this is over the last 10 years, so very much digital and smart focused. And what we found, interestingly, is that in the last 2 to 3 years alone, we're really seeing some uptake here. You can see by the red lines in terms of urban ecosystem planning. And this is kind of exciting. It could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that, there is huge recognition of the importance of urban green infrastructure in terms of municipal sustainability. It could be that just urban forestry is like taken off and everyone wants to work in this field because it's the coolest field ever, obviously. Or it could also be that there's just a higher capacity right now to integrate digital and smart technologies in urban forest ecosystem management, which is super exciting. And it's really interesting that we're seeing this happening really, really recently. What we also looked at is kind of more emerging technologies. So emerging technologies are often defined as a technology that's perhaps a little bit less understood, a little bit of uncertainty in terms of the application, like how it's really being applied, what's going on there, but also is very fast paced. So the potential for uptake is very, very quick. And so what we're seeing is that it seems like there are these technologies such as virtual and augmented environments, automation, just generally like robotics and smartness that are also kind of happening over the last few or in recent years, which is also really interesting. And I don't know if some of you are aware, but virtual and augmented environments are already being used in urban green infrastructure design and management, especially when it comes to, let's say, park design. So this is, again, kind of some interesting trends, and it kind of tells us, where are we potentially moving at this intersection of digital technologies and ecosystem management. And so what we also did as part of this horizon scanning approach or review is we wanted to really get at these key opportunities identified by researchers in the papers themselves. So researchers are saying, there's potential for technologies to automate really resource intensive processes. I used to work as a forester for the city of Montreal, and I can say there are some very laborious practices that we have in place, right? The idea of inventorying and tree inspections, and there is potential for some of these technologies to, make these processes a little bit more efficient. And actually, in some interviews that we're doing with practitioners, some have already mentioned that they're using unmanned area vehicles to carry out tree inspections, which is kind of interesting. Some technologies also present kind of lower cost, more accessible alternatives. UAVs are also an example of that, more flexible data monitoring and data collection techniques. And of course, this idea of open data. We've really entered into this era of, the idea of making data very much publicly accessible, openly available, so that anyone could go onto a data platform and use that data for a variety of purposes. Now, in the context of urban green infrastructure, of course, I mentioned that in this review, the applications in this space are really quite recent. They're not super, super pervasive, but they are happening, and the uptake seems to be quite quick. And so a few of the main applications in the context of urban forest management are forest inventorying, vegetation cover mapping, species classification, especially using machine learning techniques, and also really interestingly, and I think that this really reflects where the field of urban forestry is going or has already gone, getting at interactions between human-nature relationships. How and why do people interact with trees? Why is it important? And what are the implications of really getting at, the key elements of these relationships? And how can we also improve potentially this relationship? And I also, of course, want to mention that Canada, where I'm located right now, 80% urban, the UK, 84% urban. The world is becoming more urban as we speak. I remember when, only a few years ago, it was a huge deal that we passed the 50% threshold. And so it's very, very likely, given these trends, that we're going to continue seeing uptake in terms of technology adoption in urban ecosystem management, and potentially in ways that we can't even fathom right now. So I want to touch on some key concepts here, especially since we're kind of working with some of these concepts with projects that we're doing at the University of British Columbia, one of them being open data. So this idea that data can be freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose. Many cities around the world have already started developing or even implementing open data platforms and portals. So you can literally log on to a city website and you can download a whole bunch of data. Often it's tree inventories, maybe it's 311 calls, maybe it's information about, zoning regulations. And what's exciting about this potentially is that there's a certain amount of democratization and transparency that's happening when we make data collected by cities openly available to people who live in those cities, but there's also potential to solve problems. So there's potential for, either private sector or citizen groups or whatever to go onto these portals, download some of this data and really get at some like key urban issues. And so that's kind of presenting new opportunities as well for urban management. And just some really quick examples about how this might look in practice in terms of urban forestry research and management. There are some folks who are, downloading open data to inventory trees or to look at the diversity of trees across different cities. There are some folks who are using open mapping platforms to actually map tree cover across cities using different types of machine learning techniques. And so there is potential here, again, not just to kind of democratize the process by which we analyze data and, potentially inform decision-making, but there's also a lot of potential for collaboration here between, citizen groups, researchers, universities, and cities, which is quite exciting. So the next topic that I want to quickly go over is this idea of data fusion approaches. So with the increasing integration of digital and smart technologies into the urban fabric, there's also a lot of data being created, and there's potential to use all of these kind of different sources of data and data feeds to perhaps, bring them all together and get at more potentially consistent or accurate or even just useful information for decision making. And this is particularly important for urban forest management because we are dealing with, such social ecological systems. We live in cities, people interact with trees and green infrastructure all the time. It makes sense that we should start, or at least, figure out how to combine social and ecological data in a way that is useful for decision making. And this has been happening for quite a while, but what's great about, the potential integration of newer and more digital technologies into the urban fabric is we may have more data sources to work with. And just to give a quick overview of a really cool project that Angie and I are working on at the University of British Columbia, we are trying to kind of pilot and develop different ways that we can get at these social and ecological relationships. So how can we collect data on people? Namely, we're using smartphone data and movement data. And how can we collect information on trees? We're using some accelerometer and soil moisture data, and as well as multispectral data from UAVs, and bring all these data feeds together and get at, why do people move around certain green spaces at certain times of the day? How do they feel about certain green spaces and perhaps green space design? And how can we better design green spaces? How can we better manage trees to really suit the needs of the people who use them and who also, benefit from the ecosystem services that are provided by trees? I won't talk about this too long, but I'm happy to chat a little bit more in detail about this during questions. But the idea here is to really get at kind of more integrative way for understanding how trees and people interact in the urban environment, and also how we can enable better, perhaps more proactive and more informed management decisions from the part of urban forest managers. And so, like I said, we're using sensors, we're using UAVs, we're using mobile data to get at some of these relationships. And finally, I want to start kind of finishing off this discussion on smart cities around this idea of equity. Historically, smart cities have been a lot about the tech. What is the coolest tech that we can integrate in cities? What is the flashiest, maybe sexiest kind of tech that we can put in here to, shoot out some really cool data or data visualization and, show that we're perhaps, managing or planning a city effectively. And I think that COVID has probably brought this a little bit more to the fore. There are issues around the digital divide and around equity that could perhaps be exacerbated by the smart city discourse. And so it's important as we start figuring out and, procuring and designing technologies for urban tree management, that the decisions that we make around these technologies do not exacerbate existing inequities. And we know that there are existing inequities in cities. We know that some neighborhoods have been historically marginalized and underserved when it comes to tree canopy. We know that some neighborhoods and cities disproportionately feel heat events versus others. And so it is very important as we start testing and piloting technologies for monitoring and managing urban trees to ensure that existing inequities, particularly in the context of urban forest management, are not exacerbated. We have, if you're interested in future reading, because who doesn't like a little bedtime reading, we've put out a couple of outputs related to these projects, which I'm happy to circulate afterwards. I wrote a research brief for Open North, which again I mentioned is a nonprofit operating out of Canada, which does some work on open smart cities around managing urban green infrastructure with a smart city lens. We've also put out a nice little piece in our UBC newsletter around our project which I spoke about using this data fusion approach for looking at social and ecological relationships. And Angie and I are also working on a couple of peer-reviewed publications, which I'm sure we'd also be happy to circulate after this. And so this is just to emphasize that we are not working in the void. We really want this to be very much kind of an outreach approach as well. We're really interested in also getting feedback about the work that we do. And at the end of the day, what's really important about this is to make this, practical and applicable to how we manage cities, how we manage trees in cities. And so finally, I'll just end off on like a little bit of the brief that I wrote for Open North. These are kind of main findings that I wanted to pull from this because, people often ask me, what does this all mean? Like, what is really the role of data and connected technology in urban forest management? And the way that I like to approach it and the way that I like to explain it is kind of referring back to the cloud and smartphone idea, is that generally speaking, a lot of these kind of smart city concepts and technologies can be broadly divided into these two categories. The first being that we can use these to better or enhance the delivery of green benefits from trees. So that's perhaps through identifying, inventorying, assessing, enhancing natural assets and natural ecosystems in cities. And on the other side of the coin, because we know that, social interactions in urban forests are so important and so significant when it comes to their management, these technologies can also be used to connect natural assets, connect green infrastructure, connect urban trees to the stakeholders, to the citizens, to the managers, to the people who interact with them, who manage them, who monitor them. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity here for consultation, engagement, and meaningful stewardship as well. And there are quite a few examples out there around data and connected technology for urban tree stewardship. And I'm happy to circulate some of this brief, but I did outline some kind of key technologies and opportunities and challenges associated with these technologies. And I won't go over them too much in detail, but it's just to emphasize that there is a range and there's a spectrum, and it can really depend on local needs and context. And what's exciting is that this is very much a dynamic space. And so there's a lot of growth to be had here. And so on that note, I'll say thank you. And I know that we have some questions afterwards, and I'm also happy to do some follow-ups over email. And so I'll pass it over to Angie.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sophie. Brilliant. Lots of things to think about there. Remember, everyone, if you've got questions, don't do what you usually do and wait until the last 20 minutes, because in the last 20 minutes, we'll all be at home doing whatever fun stuff you do at home. So get your questions in now, please, whilst also simultaneously paying close attention to our next presenter, Angie. Angie, all yours.
Hi, sorry. Can you see my screen? It should be a big presentation. Yeah? All right. Thank you so much, Sophie. That was really great. My name is Angie. As you'll see, I have a little bit of a different background from Sophie, but we work together at UBC right now. And in this talk, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about just one part of this project that we've been talking about. Specifically, I'm looking a little bit more at using smartphone location data in smart cities and related to urban trees. So to introduce myself, I actually have a Bachelor in Fine Arts from UBC and also a master's degree in architecture. So actually not too much past experience in forestry, but I worked as a consultant in community engagement, and this work involved facilitating neighborhoods to create a united vision for shared public spaces, and this included outdoor and public green spaces. And I explored this further in my PhD. This is where my interest in technology and data also began. It's where I used smartphone data to learn about green space design and also to learn about how people use the greenery in their daily lives for restoration. And actually doing this is not really that new. People have been looking at how people move around cities to design them better for a long time. So in the 1960s, a famous urban theorist and researcher and designer named William White ran a famous study in the plazas of New York where he mapped how people use these spaces and the features in the spaces in order to make recommendations about how to design them. And this approach is often called behavior mapping. and it involves creating maps of people to understand their patterns of movement. In this way, designers really act as researchers because they ask things like, where do people gather? Why do they gather there? And what can we learn about this for future designs? And more recently, I think Sophie talked quite a bit about this. You've heard the term smart city. Again, it has many different meanings, and I think it's quite a loaded term. It could mean different things to different people. But to me right now, I'm talking about the smart city as an overlapping and complex converging systems that function at many scales and that are mediated and understood through technology. So technology, again, like what Sophie was talking about, it plays a key role in how we use and think about the city that we live in. So think about how you may use, say, Google Maps and how you navigate the city and how this is different from a time before we had these technologies. Or for example, how the city changes when we go to work over Zoom, or we order our food using something like Skip the Dishes. So overall, data and technology are now an everyday part of our urban experience. So here at UBC, one of the questions we're asking is how can we combine data from smartphones, drones, and fixed sensors to design more resilient cities? So I'm working with data in three main areas. The first is greenness data. So these can come from things like tree sensors. So we have sensors like right in the soil and on trees. Also remote sensing data from UAVs. And these are to help us understand things like the condition of the green stuff in our cities. I'm also working with social data, so that can include data from phones, as well as infrastructure data like buildings, roads. We're also looking at using perception data. So that's information that comes from surveys, questionnaires, asking people how they feel about their environments, and of course, other data sources like census. And the idea is to think about how we can bring this data together to understand relationships in the city. And through these relationships, we can understand how communities rely on connections to nature and social connections to face challenges like climate change or natural disasters. So as you know, I presume, smartphones have the potential to continuously record our locations as we move through our daily routines. So researchers over the past decades have anticipated that this data will be essential for designers of urban spaces to make better designs, and this will ultimately benefit the public. But the question is really, and how? So I'm interested in data from the GPS sensor that provides a location and timestamp, because this allows us to understand how people move around the city in their daily lives. So of course, the question always comes up, how do you get this data, especially considering privacy? And to be fair, the data can be quite revealing about people, and privacy is definitely a concern. Another concern is that people have autonomy about choosing whether or not they share their data and allowing them to know what's being done with their data. So in the past, researchers have actually been quite creative in finding ways that suit their local culture and ensuring that they address privacy concerns and, of course, laws in the area that they're working. So in the past, some researchers, these are just some examples of how people have collected the data. They've developed like a dedicated phone application that asks people directly if you can track them or use their data. And the application will track users for a period of time or when they're within a geographic location. There's also examples of large campaigns where organizations have asked people to send in their personal data. One example is the European Cycling Challenge. Across Europe, cities have sort of competed related to cycling in their city, and it's asked people individually to download their personal cycling information that they collect from an application like Strava, and then send it in. There's also the option of purchasing data from third-party applications that collect and sell data, and they will privatize it or have their own sort of systems for doing that. There are also researchers who have relationships directly with phone companies who also have to abide within privacy laws and restrictions. Or they are options to gather data that's a byproduct of an existing app. So there are applications like Google Takeout that allows individuals to personally download their data and then they can share it with a researcher. And this also, some studies and researchers have incorporated in various incentives. Some have even offered things like a free phone with a tracking application that people know that's what the phone is doing, or otherwise free internet service for the duration of the study, or otherwise other helpful information within the application that people feel is a fair exchange for sharing their data. So I've talked a little bit about smartphone data, how we plan to use it and also collect it. In my past research, I've done a bit of exploring into how it can be used in 3 main areas. So these are in modeling and prediction, in public engagement, and in data visualization. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about those studies I did because I hope it provides some examples about how the data could be used in the future. So in data modeling and prediction, we think about these large data sets as an opportunity to learn about people and their environments in a way we can't just learn by guessing. So the details about movement patterns let us build evidence that in some cases actually tells us about the impact of decisions we make on the everyday lives of people. So we can ask, are there repeating, predictable patterns in human behavior that help us understand relationships between people and their environment? So for example, we can start to figure out how people change their behavior in different weather or climate conditions. And this could tell us more about the benefits or impacts on the urban forest. It could also help us locate new places or features in a city because we know how and where people use them. We could be aware of the impacts of routines on various uses, so we can prepare, for example, when a park is likely to get very busy or when trash cans need to be more frequently emptied. So in one of my research projects, I did a statistical study using smartphone data where I modeled the effects of design features and campus green spaces on student selection of locations to linger, and I used what's called an urban resource selection function. So in my case, I used this resource selection function, which was originally used by ecologists to monitor movement of radio-colored animals. And this is interesting because it shows how statistics like this can be used to understand preferences, even when we can't talk to our participants and ask them. So spatial temporal data has been used for a long time to understand preferences of animals just based on their movement patterns. So in this kind of model, the response variable compares used locations with randomly generated locations that were not used. And factors in the model include proximity to things like trees, benches, and water fountains. So basically, we're wondering if the location of things like trees, benches, and water fountains affect where students select to linger. So since our participants are human and not animals, we also asked people how they feel about these features and compared this with how they behaved in the data. So we asked 362 students where they spend time outdoors on campus and which features support their well-being. And then we analyzed the smartphone GPS data to identify points of 62 students who repeatedly use the outdoor green spaces on campus. And we actually found that the results were not the same. In fact, some features that were important to the questionnaire students actually had a negative effect on the tracked students. So we found this study was really important for validating the use of smartphone data. Just because people like something or report using it doesn't mean it will actually be used regularly. And it's really important to include different data types. It also shows us the locations people actually use, which were interestingly near food and parking lots. And that these are where people spend a lot of time and they might be prioritized in terms of where to add new design. So in another study, I examined how non-experts use visualizations of smartphone GPS data to make a design decision. The idea here was to understand if regular people would use smartphone data and if it makes sense for organizations to use it in a public engagement scenario. So I asked 48 participants, where should we locate an outdoor student hub on campus? And then we showed them maps of smartphone data. And then we asked them the same question, where should we locate the hub? And we compared the answers. So we found that most participants selected a Western quad at first, but then we showed that the data shows that people spend more time on the eastern side of campus. And after seeing the data, most participants changed their decision. So we found that people do use it to make a decision, but only in certain cases. And that's when there's an overlap between a reality that the data can reveal, what the public is wrong about, and a publicly perceived criteria for good design. So when these overlap, it's a good opportunity to use smartphone data in public engagement, and it's likely it will have an impact on the decisions that are made. So in the future, I'm going to be looking at other ways that smartphone data can be used by organizations to relate to the public. So specifically, I want to explore how the data can foster engagement from the public to engage in projects or initiatives, how data visualizations might impact public image of an organizations that host them on their website, and also how these data visualizations can be used to create awareness about certain topics among the public. So finally, in another study, we created a smartphone GPS data visualization tool called the University of Calgary Smart Campus Tool. So this data visualization is now publicly available, and the website is on the screen. When we first open it, you can see all of the data that we collected represented on the university campus. At the top right, you can see there's 5,530 paths and 181 students. And it goes from September 2013 to May 2017. You can click the link on the project, gives you more information, and the map and screen is zoomable and panable. So on the right, there's a small box and it opens the filtering tools. And you can see there are two buttons at the top, and you can see right now it's showing paths, but you can also select on these rest points. So rest points are locations that people stayed in one place. The size of the point represents how long they stayed, and the color represents the time of day. If you scroll down, you will see some distributions which allow you to filter the data. And you can also quickly see that most of our data is during the school year, with only a little during the summer. And if you scroll down further, you can see we also have weekdays, time of day, and other weather variables. And at the very bottom is a legend showing the color map. For rest points, the color shows time of day. But if we select paths, you can see the azimuth path color legend. So path colors are represented by the direction of movement. So people walking north will be red, people walking south will be cyan, east green, and west purple. At the top, you can also use this toggle compare, and that opens a second filtering view where you can make different selections. And then you can toggle across the screen to visually compare two filtered options. If we close out of these filtering boxes, we can also see this Polygon Tool. The tool allows us to select regions that are crossed by paths. We can select regions that cover one building of interest. We can also select a second region to identify paths between two specific buildings. So this visualization was tested among architects to see how they use it to make a design decision. But in the future, I'm looking at how to visualize multiple layers of data to learn about important relationships and make impactful decisions. In particular, we're interested in combining mobile data and data about urban trees. So here at UBC, our project is exploring using mobile data to understand relationships between urban forest conditions and human spatial use patterns. So here we have a map of the UBC campus, and we're showing some data layers at the bottom. These could include things like greenness data, multispectral data from UAVs and mobile data. And the idea is you could turn these layers on and off and use a slider to see how they change over time. So we're still collecting this data. So this is just a represented image to get the idea across. It's not actual real data. So you can see how it changes. So mobile data can also help us learn about interactions between populations and many environmental features such as air pollution and urban design layouts. We're currently creating a visualization for us to bring together all this data sets represented here at UBC. So I think if I press it, it will move. Okay. So this little demo video shows how we imagine different data being visualized together. In this visualization, you can see the mobile data. So the hex height and color represents a density of people. We then see the tree locations on campus where we've installed sensors. The idea is that we can learn a little about the trees, and you'd be able to visually see both human density and tree condition changing over time. And this again is simulated data, but it's just to try and show you one way we're thinking about visualizing this data together. Okay. So this is really the dream. In the end, it's to create a large-scale, multi-layer visualization that highlights interactions between humans and urban forests. And I think the uses for this is broader than just to support decision-making. I think these visualizations are really fascinating for the public and can create awareness about urban forest risks and can promote engagement by the public in new initiatives. This is an area that we are exploring in our research. And finally, the ideal is to use all of these data to help us understand how human use patterns impact urban forests and vice versa. And we expect that this will be especially important during a time when climate change is really making long-term predictions very challenging, and life in cities more difficult. And people are also very curious about what they can do to make a difference. We'd like to use these data to foster a mutually beneficial relationship between trees and people in cities well into the future, so that people's everyday activities like their walk to work can benefit from and possibly support the trees in our cities. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. And I think Sophie and I are here to answer questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Angie. And thank you, Sophie, as well. Okay, this is interesting, this one. Lots of questions. I don't know if you've been looking at the questions. Lots of questions. I'm just going to go right in with a kind of question that I wanted to ask. It's going to make me sound like 100 years old, but I'm going to do it anyway. And some of our audience have legitimized my question by mentioning it. I'm going to ask this to both of you. I'll go to Sophie first, then Angie. But I think, is this a bit scary to people like me, who are old people, who don't really want to be traced necessarily where we're going? There's something a little bit kind of weird maybe about your data being used to inform stuff, even if it's informing something positive. Ben, who I think might be even more paranoid than me, but thank you, Ben, has said, who's the biggest funders of all of this technology? The corporations, foundations. So how would you sort of address people who have those kind of concerns? Sophie first, and then we'll go to Angie.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And I think actually Ben, I don't know if it was Ben who put it on the chat, something about 1984 and Big Brother. And I just finished a book called Surveillance Capitalism, which talks about that, where it's not so much actually Big Brother, but it's more the private sector that we potentially have to worry about when it comes to surveillance. And I think that it's a legitimate concern, and I think it's legitimate to bring it up. I think especially because the smart cities discourse, especially as it has emerged in the last perhaps 10 years, has very much been kind of shrouded in private sector interests. It's very much been kind of the IBMs and the Microsofts and the Googles of the world who have come in and basically been like, hey, we're going to throw a whole bunch of sensors into your city because we'll help you, design it better, we'll help you make better decisions, when of course there are potential issues around privacy and data concerns. And to answer this question, and perhaps this is a very political response, but I'm going to bring up an example, which I think highlights some potentially exciting responses to these concerns. So I don't know if anyone is aware about this, but Google was involved in a project in the city of Toronto in Canada called Sidewalk Toronto. And their idea was to create a smart neighborhood in Toronto. And so they wanted to, I think they were taking over part of the waterfront, and they were like, we're going to put in kind of smart sensors, we're going to put in modular technologies, and we're doing all of this in partnership with the government, and it's going to be great. And that's what it was. But what ended up happening is that they were not being entirely transparent about what they were doing. And there were lots of concerns from the citizens of Toronto about privacy, about data usage, about selling data, et cetera. And what ended up happening at the end of the day actually is that the project failed. Google pulled out of Toronto, and there was a lot of public dissent. There was not a lot of support at the end of the day. And so I think that highlights a shift that is happening right now in the smart cities discourse, which is people are aware. People know what they want. They know what they want from their cities. And I think that it has brought forward an opportunity to engage more meaningfully with the private sector, because we can't deny that the private sector will play a role in this, but we can design better partnerships, more transparent, more open partnerships when it comes to technology. And I think that there are enough people, the populace, there's enough awareness there to make that happen and make that engagement happen more meaningfully. So I perhaps didn't totally answer that question, but I think that example is a really good one of how pushback and lack of public support can actually counter some of these surveillance and perhaps more nefarious concerns, which I think is actually really exciting.
Thanks, Sophie. Angie, have you got anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, no, that's great, Sophie. I mean, obviously, when you work with smartphone data in the area I work with, this is always like the first question. So I appreciate you asking it, John, and everybody else in the chat. And I agree with Sophie. I think it's really important. I mean, the approach that I've been taking is I actually think because these fears are legitimate, it's a prime opportunity for those of us who are interested in it to really step up and learn about it and to really engage in that. Because I feel like if it's a very black and white solution, it's always going to be, this opportunities for injustice are much stronger. Whereas if more people are really engaged in it, I think we need more policy in this area. We need a lot more knowledge across the whole spectrum, experts also just down to the general population. So I fully encourage people to really get involved, to know what tracking is, what's being tracked, what's the data being used. And I fully support people having the autonomy to make their own choices about that. I think that's really important, especially as researchers, if we want to use the data. So yeah, I really actually advocate for more education in that area and for people to get involved and to be engaged in it. Because I actually think, I can't really speak, I have no idea from the private sector, but I do feel like they appreciate that engagement too. They're responsive. Like Sophie said, they know their projects won't go ahead if they don't have that support. So I think that the impetus is there on all sides. So that's kind of the approach I've been taking.
Thanks very much, Angie. We probably only got about just under 15 minutes left, so we'll rattle through a few more questions. This might be a quick one. Again, I'll put it to both of you. Sophie first. Chris said, thanks very much for the talk. Chris is new to the topic of smart cities, very interesting. Do you know of any examples of UK smart cities or projects which use the Internet of Things to monitor tree health or ecosystem services? So I'll put that to Sophie, but then also Angie for your work as well. UK examples.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I am familiar with one. I don't know what stage it's at. And so I may not be able to speak too much about it. And I could potentially follow up with you, John, if you want to disseminate it out to the group who's here. I do know that there's some work being done on soil moisture sensors. I think it's, the name escapes me now, but I know that it's happening. So they're installing soil moisture sensors around trees in certain town squares. And the idea is that these can then send out text messages or emails to people who are involved in the management of these trees when it comes to watering needs. And I believe it's being done in conjunction with a university. I think it might be Myersboro. Am I crazy that there's a university like that? Okay, so I think that there's something happening there, but it's very, very new, which is why I'm being a bit uncertain about all this. And I don't, we're having issues here in Canada, and I'm sure in the UK about kind of sudden droughts and the need to kind of water, especially newly planted trees quite quickly, and especially kind of fastidiously. And so the idea of these sensors using the Internet of Things is to get a kind of more proactive watering and management needs. So that's the kind of prime example I can think of in the UK in terms of IoT for urban forest management in particular. There's also groups in Europe that are developing and I think that there are some actually in the UK now developing smart green infrastructure, they call it. And it's kind of a combination of a bench and I think it's kind of like this kind of green wall or something like that. And the idea is to, get at air pollution, particulate removal, get at kind of cooling effects and all that kind of good stuff. And so there are some initiatives happening in Europe, and it's a question of whether they're being disseminated in the UK. But the one in the UK, I think that's what I'm thinking of is the soil moisture sensor stuff, which is really exciting. I think that could be really cool.
Absolutely. I think Andy Hirons, might be involved in that.
Yes.
I think. Angie, any smartphone stuff that you know of going on in the UK?
No, I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't know. None are coming right to the top of my head. We just did a literature review and I've got a billion studies in my head kind of floating, but I can't think of any right off the top of my head in UK. But if I do come across some, I can share them. Thanks.
Well, looking at the chat, I wouldn't share them because I think we'll all be out with pitchforks. But I'm not saying whether I'd be in the crowd of pitchfork wielding people or not, but I'm just generally scared of technology. Okay, cool. Thank you. There's a question there that I really liked. Where is it? Okay. Question from Ian. Ian's asked some really good questions today. Sophie, in your presentation towards the end, you mentioned green equity, which is an issue that we're really hoping is going to sort of take off more in the UK. It's going to be involved in our conference we'll be talking about. But I pretty much learned most of what I know about green equity from one of your colleagues, Lorian Nesbitt, over in UBC. And Ian has mentioned that really, which is that deprived urban areas that have the poorest physical and mental health and quality of life investment in green infrastructure in these areas can yield the greatest and most comprehensive benefit. Ian's asking, does data access deprivation also occur in those same areas? And if so, what strategies can be used to remedy that deficit? So do we have less data from those more deprived areas too?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I can't necessarily really generalize because I think it does often depend on the local context, but generally speaking, yes, often we do have a lack of data on particularly underserved and marginalized communities. Not everyone owns a smartphone, and often those who don't own a smartphones are the ones who are perhaps, homeless or seniors, or underserved in other areas. And so, of course, there is a data gap here. There's an issue, and we know that data gaps occur in urban planning. There's that great book on data gaps for women, I think it was, that they talk about the issues around cities and how cities are planned not for women, but often just for the average male. And it's not just the case for women. So data gaps do exist, and they are hugely concerning, especially when we get to kind of more technical, perhaps machine learning algorithms and training data sets where, algorithms might be trained on incomplete data. And so what might end up happening is that you're really modeling just one section of the population. And so that's a challenge. And I would say that in terms of remedying that, it's tough because often there are lots of complex issues there around why neighborhoods are perhaps underserved. Perhaps it has to do with, broadband connectivity and just generally like right infrastructure, that the infrastructure just isn't there in terms of, data collection. I will say that what is potentially exciting about the use of, let's say, sensors for monitoring green infrastructure in these areas is that if we can get the sensors there, so if we can really get at kind of this finer scale data collection around green infrastructure, trees in different neighborhoods and cities, we will be able to understand truly like finer scale interactions between people and trees and green infrastructure in different neighborhoods and get at interactions between, let's say, socioeconomics and demographics and how trees survive. We know actually that sometimes trees don't survive well in certain neighborhoods compared to others. Sometimes though, the effects and the interactions are unclear. And so I think that what's potentially exciting about being able to, throw sensors into certain neighborhoods just to look at trees in certain neighborhoods and cities is to get at these finer scale questions of why trees perhaps don't do as well in certain neighborhoods over others. And I'm sure that we might find actually that trees do worse in underserved neighborhoods for a variety of reasons, but that is truly concerning. And I think that that's when we can really get at the root of equity issues. It's not just a question of planting trees as much as possible in underserved areas, it's making sure that they survive, that they reach maturity. And we need to know that that's possible. And I think that data has a role to play in that.
Yeah, that's interesting actually as well about potentially there's almost an inbuilt bias, and I'll come to Angie in a minute, but like an inbuilt bias in the smartphone data particularly, which might be kind of discriminatory against elderly people predominantly who might not to generalize about all elderly people, who might not have those smartphones on them. So Angie, is there a risk in the work that you've been doing that you're sort of unintentionally discriminating against groups without smartphones?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a risk. There's actually been a little bit of literature published about that lately, about that sort of embedded data biases, especially with technology. But I will say also, the potential for those data also to provide information about a range of demographics actually is also pretty great. Like we know currently, the way we collect data about mostly in public engagement processes and about sort of social data, a lot of it is through sort of engaging with the public. And we know typically the people who are showing up at public engagement town hall meetings are not that vulnerable community. Like we're not typically getting representation in a lot of our processes that make these decisions currently. So I would say it's actually very poor. And the spread of demographics that you can get from smartphone use is way broader than the spread of people that you're going to really be getting at a town hall meeting or from various, if we send out a survey to the general population, it's usually very poor in terms of its representation across different groups. And that's what we're currently using to base decisions on. So the potential for smartphones to actually be used by a wider, broader community group is actually, I think, quite high, but it has to also be acknowledged and carefully sort of analyzed in terms of who's actually, submitting the data and make sure it's balanced and represented. So I also sort of advocate for communities, I think it's really important that communities have access to their own data in that sense, and also that they can use that data to advocate for their own needs, and that and I think there's lots of potential in that area because data is really powerful. It's very hard for a community group to advocate for their needs if they don't have evidence to support what they're saying. So if they do have the data from whether it's from their smartphones or from sensors on trees or from whatever, to really clearly illustrate and show very clearly to the rest of the community, look, we're underrepresented and we are vulnerable in these situations and we're not being accounted for, then it actually, I think, can be quite powerful. So that is, I think, an important way that this data could help.
Thank you very much, Angie. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to do one question to Sophie, one question to Angie, and then our final question. So unless your question is the best one in the world you've ever thought of, don't ask it. We probably won't get through. But there's loads of questions I'll send on to Angie and Sophie afterwards. So panic not. Okay, Sophie. David has made the point that much of the urban forest in the UK sits under the municipal care of a council, which employs many staff. In Canada or anywhere else in your experience, have you found an inherent resistance to deploying technology through a fear of streamlining staff and losing people, people losing their jobs as a result of the technology?
That's an excellent question. And it's something that's come up a little bit in our literature review, this idea of AI, for example, taking away people's jobs. And I think that, I don't think that that's necessarily what the fear is of technology adoption. So I don't think municipalities, or at least in Canada, it's often the case in Canada as well, that most urban trees are under the care of municipalities. That municipalities are thinking, we can't, use a lot of technology because it will likely replace these people. I think that what's actually happening is that there's a lot involved with technology procurement, with training people, with increasing capacity to use technology. I think that that's more where the barriers are. And that being said, to the point about potential techno unemployment, I think that the risk there is not so much that jobs will be replaced. I think that the risk is actually potentially that jobs will change. So that, for example, urban foresters will perhaps have to become a little bit more technologically literate and know the basics of geographic information systems, and even perhaps using different data sources, or using the open data portal, being able to contribute to open data portals for municipal governments. And so I don't necessarily see the risk, and I haven't really seen this talking to practitioners and kind of looking at our literature review, that jobs are going to be replaced necessarily. It's that they will change, and the skills required for these jobs will also change and shift. And so I think that a key component here is education, and figuring out exactly what the skills and what the needs are for these professions as they move on and as they move forward, and making sure that there are, let's say, transitionary programs that we can implement, but also we're teaching skills from the ground up to students at UBC, to students around the world who are engaged in urban forestry and arboriculture.
Thank you, Sophie. Absolutely right. Oh, we've got 2 minutes, right. Angie, you've got a minute for this question, then we've got 30 seconds each for our last one. I really like this question from Ian. Ian is asking if you found any surprises in the actual density of movements versus those areas that were prioritized for tree hazard assessment. Were the right areas being looked at? Often we carve up our urban areas in terms of where we're going to focus our efforts on tree inspections. Are we getting it right?
Great question. We don't know yet because we haven't done it yet. That's basically the question for our research. So thanks, Ian, for clarifying it. But yeah, that's what we're going to be looking at with the data. And we're still basically compiling the data and putting it in a format where we can kind of answer that question. But I do think that the movement patterns and my previous experience is a little bit surprising in that we do see people moving in places maybe that we didn't know, like parts, they might be taking a commuter route, say where I was on the university, that, we didn't realize people were arriving at the university through this back door to the biology building, and that's actually probably the busiest door on campus. And they actually did redesign that door based on that information. So I think that it does have the potential to show us things that we don't know otherwise.
Brilliant, thank you. Will you come back and tell us all of your research when you find out what you've got? Good. Okay, it's now 7 o'clock, so we're going to go really, really quickly. Sophie's got another meeting to go to. Sophie, what is your favourite tree-related book?
Okay, I have a couple. Sorry, John. One of these here is Le Tour du Monde en 80 arbres, in English, around the world in 80 trees. I'm sure a lot of folks have taken a look at this. The pictures are magnificent, and it just takes me into a world where we used to be allowed to travel, and hopefully that will happen again. And actually, I do have another second favorite book, which is just a nice tree book about the Arboretum in Ottawa, which is one of my favorite places in the world. If anyone wants to come to Ottawa and needs a tour around the Arboretum, I will take you. Just let me know.
You want to be careful making that kind of offer in front of this audience, because you're lucky there's a pandemic. Otherwise, lots of people, everyone wants to travel everywhere and see everything. Brilliant. Thank you, Sophie. And Angie, what's your favorite tree-related book?
Oh, right. So I've got a very designy book. If there's any landscape architects, they'll know it. My screen. It's called Design with Nature by Ian McHarg. And the other book I'd highly recommend, not tree related, but Data in Action by Sarah Williams. This is a great book if you want to think about how data can be used in cities to support public good. So highly recommend.
Brilliant, thank you. And we'll make sure we get the names and the authors and everything listed under the YouTube thing, and you can have it all. All the questions, all the chat we'll send to our presenters, and they'll be able to answer you at their leisure or not or whatever. So good. Sophie, Angie, thank you both so much. You're absolutely brilliant. That was really interesting. And thank you, Sophie, for taking the time to squeeze us in for your next webinar. You're all wonderful out there. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Sophie, behind the scenes, for organising it all. And hopefully see you next week for another Ted Green extravaganza. And remember to go and book your conference tickets. Go now. Go and do it now. You've got a free hour. Go do your conference tickets. Thank you very much.